right, for the rest of the night, we'll talk about really what the Abbasids do that's so much different, and eventually some internal resistance to what the Abbasids want to focus on in their differences. Eventually, we'll get into, after the Abbasid go into a collapse phase, the rise of the next big empire in that part of the world called the Ottoman Empire. That will last a long, long, long time. Okay, so last time we left off with this map with a giant revolt starting up in northeastern Persia. Successful at first, and that inspires the Egyptians and many, many other groups around the whole empire to all rise up at the same time, and they bring down the Umayyad and replace it with the Abbasid state. The Abbasid do everything they possibly can to stay in control. They realized that this revolution against the Umayyad was a revolution that was angry at central government and imperial government. So the Abbasid just take every possible step they can and make every promise they can that if Egypt and North Africa and Persia, if they just stay part of the empire, that the empire will be better run. And all these different kind of nationalities, they'll all be partners in the empire. So it won't be like a central government in Damascus forcing everyone else to adhere and to follow orders. They're going to be brought to the table, and their opinions are going to be valued, and they're going to be kind of equal governors of the empire. Does that make sense? Another thing that the Abbasid do is they figure out pretty quickly that all those attacks on Constantinople in Europe turned out to be so catastrophic that that's what started the ball rolling on this revolution against them. So the Abbasid, they will not attack Europe anymore. They figure that's a losing proposition. So they will instead launch attacks further eastward to try to conquer northern India, and they hope eventually into East Asia. So that's where they're looking at as their kind of frontier for conquest. Doesn't work very well, but they say it's more likely to work there than it was in Europe. And they also moved their capital out of Damascus because there's a lot of old Umayyad loyalists still in Damascus, so they don't want the capital city there anymore because they're afraid of being overthrown, basically. So they moved the capital city eastward to Baghdad, which is still a city. It's not a gigantic city at that point, but it's closer to their eastward invasions. And Baghdad is also surrounded by this huge amount of fertile land. So you can scale up the city real fast and increase its population and still have a reliable, close-by food supply. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of trade routes that go straight through Baghdad that go into northern India. So it's seen as a better place for controlling and directing the armies. Does that make sense? So Baghdad probably had about 30 or 40,000 people in it before the imperial capital moves there, and within a decade or two that grows to 500,000. So it's massively increased. That's often what happens when you get a big government moving in. They need to build a bunch of buildings. They need government palaces. They need administrative centers. They need scribes and paper supplies and legion of diplomats and military analysts and all kinds of things. So they start building massive buildings all over the place real fast. And they'll start building universities in Baghdad to train the next generation of government employees. Does that make sense? So Baghdad explodes at this point in population and importance to the whole region of the world. Let's see. The Abbasid will do a lot of other things. They will open up government to anyone born in any place in the whole empire. And they'll call this a meritocracy. Basically, the Umayyad, toward their end, had only given high-level government positions to Arabs, people born in Arabia. That's where the Umayyad were from, and they felt that was the only people they could really trust. And that angered people born in, say, Egypt or anywhere else in the whole empire. Because if you're born in one of the provinces, you can only rise so high, right? There's a limit to how far you can go and how much government authority you could accumulate, how much power you could hold. Because all the top positions were held by ethnic Arabs. The Abbasid will do basically the exact opposite. They will open up government possibilities to anyone born anywhere in the empire. And it's a very kind of similar thing that other empires have done. If you're born into an average kind of family anywhere in the empire and you can somehow get educated, you could go to kind of primary school, and you're a really good student, and you can eventually get into the universities. And of course, the biggest university is in Baghdad itself. If you can somehow get a degree, you can go work for the government, and through your lifetime, you can work your way up through the administration, through the bureaucracy. So anyone, even born into poverty in many places of the empire, it doesn't matter who you are, what language you speak, or where you're from. If you're a good, efficient government worker, you can rise to the ranks to, by the time you get to kind of retirement age, you could be one of the high advisors to the emperor, the king, the caliph. Does it make sense? So you rise based on merit, not based on family connections. It's what you know, not who you know. So it's a very different kind of bureaucracy than the Umayyad had run, at least toward their end. And that's one thing that convinces a lot of these peoples, like the Egyptians especially, to stay in the Abbasid Empire, to stay within the overall kind of patchwork of different peoples, because now there's open opportunity. Does it make sense? And it's generally a pretty good strategy to keep people, or to convince people to stay. Give them a chance. Because historians often argue that any group of people who grows up in a certain place and they feel they have no real opportunity, they leave, if they can. Sometimes under desperate circumstances. And historians call that voting with your feet. Basically saying,
you leave.
Yeah, I don't like this place, it sucks, so I'm leaving.
Like a job.
Yep. Or if you grow up in a city you don't like because of pollution or traffic or whatever, you just go to another place. And if you have that happening on a very large scale, you have a bunch of people moving out of a place, that's like it's like a democratic vote of the people. This place sucks, let's go somewhere else. And you have that happen several times, kind of mass migrations in human history, for one reason or another. So the Abbasids realized that, or the Abbasid leadership realized that, and they have to open up their government to all these different nationalities within their empire. And they successfully do it, at least for a little while, for a few decades. And they do the same thing with the military. The Umayyad, toward their end, their military was completely led and dominated by ethnic Arabs, because the Umayyad just didn't really trust anybody else. And obviously get rid of that. They open up the army to being promoted based on success on the battlefield, bravery on the battlefield. So you could join the army from any section of the empire, any locality, and through proven service, you can rise through your lifetime to be one of the high generals. Does that make sense? So they're doing the same thing with the military, and people all over the empire love it. Because now, again, you have a chance. And obviously, largely, they don't focus on military conquest. They're not interested in fighting big wars. The Abbasid leadership is much more interested in growing their economy, getting more trade going, getting more money flowing through the system. And they believe that was the source of real kind of worldly power. If you get a bigger economy than all your enemies, then you can, have taxes in your economy and get your government more funding, more revenue. And that's where power comes from. At least that's what they believed. And a lot of other governments and groups have believed the same thing. And they're going to use their very advantageous position geographically in the world that we've already talked about before, the center of this pathway to go from Europe into Central and Eastern Asia. They're going to use that as one of their big tax bases, basically. So they're going to encourage commerce, the buying and selling of goods, and the moving of travelers all across their empire. They're not looking to shut it down at all. They want that movement because that movement brings wealth. And with this gigantic increase in commerce, a natural result of that, when you have people going to other places they've never really been that much before, and they're allowed to openly travel through territory and talk about whatever they want and dress however they want and go through areas basically wherever they want, what you generally get is more human contact. And it's much like if you, we're kind of used to this growing up in the Los Angeles area. But what happens when you end up sitting next to someone in a restaurant or in a classroom and they're from a place in the world that you've never been to? What do you talk about?
What's it like where you're from?
Yeah. What's it like where you're from? What's the weather like? What kind of cars do you drive? What kind of social customs do you have, right? What do weddings look like in your culture?
I'm trying to find out what you're saying.
Oh, yeah, that could be a problem too. But usually these travelers come through with translators, people that are real talented. I mean, some people are really good at just picking up languages, right? Real fast. I was never good at that. I had to study for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to get the basics. But some people, their minds are just really open to that. Just like some people are really just naturally good at math. I don't know how. Makes no sense to me, but yeah, you get this kind of exchange of culture. And when the government's really open to allowing that, you get people talking to each other about different ideas, different theories, different social customs and structures. And what that often leads to is people studying outside ideas. And when you study someone else's ideas and think about how they do things, you often think, wow, that's really different from how we do things here. Does that make sense? And that leads to sometimes a big round of questions. Well, why are we doing what we do here? Maybe we should update this system, make changes. Does that make sense? So this whole process of just bringing people together can start whole waves of questions about social structures and customs and ideas and all kinds of things. And it leads to sometimes an intellectual explosion. People start writing books about the differences and start making proposals for how to make things better. Does that make sense? And you get that in the, obviously, state, in their kind of time and control. One example is that this is the time where Arabic numbers start to spread all across all the civilizations we're talking about, especially into India and eventually going into Europe. Because the Arabic numbering system is much more efficient for doing large calculations. Like, what kind of numbers are the people in Europe still using at this point? Yeah, they're using Roman numerals. Have you ever seen Roman numerals? How do you write the number 64 in Roman numerals? Does anyone know? 64 is not even really that big of a number, right?
When
You're
you get
talking
into
about
triple
thousands of
digits,
millions.
Yeah, it gets almost impossible.
Yeah. When you take like the Roman numeral for 64, which is like, what? Oh God, I can't remember.
It's long.
50 is L, is that right?
I think so, yeah.
So it's LXV, LXIV.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what happens when you have to multiply that Roman numeral by the Roman numeral for 283? it's not easy. So the Europeans are not able to do large-scale calculations. Does that make sense? But the Arabic numbering system, which is the numbers that you use now, how do you write 64? 2 digits. How do you write 283? It's just 3 digits, and you add them or multiply them together, whatever you're doing. Much easier, much more efficient for large-scale calculations in Roman numerals. Does that make sense? And that's why most of the world now uses the Arabic numbering system, the 0 through 9 digits that you're familiar with today.
The 0 wasn't around that time, though,
I think it is.
right? Well,
I'm no mathematical historian. But the Europeans, they don't come up with big ideas for like algebra. That's all comes from other parts of the world, and the Europeans just eventually adapted. So the Europeans are mathematically and scientifically pretty far behind, eventually, say, what we today call the Middle East under the Abbasids, and especially China. The Europeans they're way, way far behind in scientific developments. They're basically backward. And it's not until the Europeans start catching up and start using, especially this numbering system, well, they'll start catching up to algebra and eventually develop calculus. And another thing that the Abbasid state did, they built a giant university system in Baghdad itself, and smaller kind of universities and colleges and whatnot throughout all their holdings, because they believe in education and the power of education. But one thing that the Abbasid universities start doing is paying scholars to travel into all these different areas that their traders have contacted and learn and study all the most valuable scientific and philosophical ideas coming from all those cultures. And they bring them back to their own universities and scale them up or add on the next wave of scientific innovation or whatever they have to do for that system they studied. And you can see this in really obvious ways. One of the most famous philosophers that they studied was actually an ancient Greek guy, not even from their area. So they went into Greece and translated all the ancient Greek philosophical texts, which many of the Greeks and the Europeans by this point have just kind of forgotten about. And they bring them back to Baghdad and study them, and make, especially Aristotle seems to be their favorite, because he wrote on so many different kinds of topics, natural sciences and philosophy and politics and all kinds of stuff. But they make Aristotle's books like some of the major textbooks in their own university system. And this is a picture out of one of their books, which is supposed to be Aristotle teaching his followers dressed in the customs of the Abbasid culture of the time. So they're taking him out of ancient Greeks and they're making him one of their own. You know, Aristotle probably never dressed like that or sat in a chair like that or conducted classes like that or anything, right? They're adopting him, basically. And they don't just deal with Aristotle or just with the Greeks, they deal with all the Roman stuff they come in contact with and all Chinese stuff and Indian stuff, and they're basically taking the knowledge of the ancient world and bringing it back to their own homes and making it the kind of core curriculum for their own universities. So they come to know more about ancient Greek philosophy than the Greeks do at that time. And Baghdad becomes probably the center of, say, human scientific knowledge and philosophy in the whole world for hundreds of years, even beyond after the Abbasid state eventually collapses. And they don't just do it with Aristotle, they go forward from there. And they go into a kind of mini scientific revolution that is focused on critical thinking and proposing a hypothesis and testing it according to evidence, the scientific method. Does that make sense? And this is going on at a point in time when the Europeans aren't even reading anymore. Europe is a free-for-all of all these different warlords. This is the European Dark Ages. Europeans mostly can't even read and write their own name. Even the kings of Europe can't even read and write their own name. So if you ever seen like, what are those TV shows like the Vikings or...
Yeah, Vikings. They have it on their
That's what's going on in Europe.
Yeah.
They ain't reading. They're out there slaughtering each other and trying to get more farmland and trying to get enough food to eat. And this is what Muslim empires are doing, Muslim kingdoms are doing all over what we today call the Middle East and North Africa. So they're light years ahead of what Europeans are slaughtering each other in mud huts, basically. Does that make sense? And it'll take hundreds of years for the Europeans to catch up. Europeans won't start to catch up until about at least the 1600s. So that's how the world is for the rest of our semester in History 1. Does that make sense? All right. And it's largely, the Europeans won't catch up until the 1600s until they start their own scientific revolution and start thinking about evidence and data and especially mathematics again. But that's history too. But again, the Abbasid traders and scholars and whatnot, they don't just go into ancient European areas and study Greek ideas. They go everywhere in the known world to them. They even get all the way to China. And they bring back Chinese inventions. The most famous of which are Chinese gunpowder. And they'll refine it to make a big cannon out of it. Big artillery, basically. They also bring back Chinese advances in medicine and travel. They bring back the Chinese kind of very first magnetic compass. And the Abbasids and later Muslim kingdoms will kind of adapt it and mass produce it. So they will be the height of scientific knowledge for the next few hundred years. Well, the Abbasids, you're mostly talking in the late 700s and 800s. But they'll be at the height of human knowledge probably for about 800 years. Which is one of the real interesting stories about, say, history, too. You walk into that class at about the year 1500, and most people just assume that Europe has always been running the world, but no, that's a fairly recent change. These guys are running the world. The Muslim kingdoms, and in the year 1500, there's this later empire called the Ottoman Empire we'll get to tonight. They're the center of power. And the Europeans are always worried about being wiped out. So the Europeans are fighting each other, but they're worried about surviving against the massive invasions of this technologically advanced Islamic civilization. Does that make sense? All right. But not all people in the Abbasid holdings, the empire, were happy about this focus on trade and commerce and making money, and also like the discovery of new ideas and how exciting scientific explorations or innovations and all that stuff. A lot of people are not happy with that in the empire. A lot of people in the empire start saying, this isn't what Islam was supposed to be about. Muhammad talked about developing a personal relationship with God, and that's what humans are supposed to do, and that's what God wants us to do. So a lot of Muslim leaders within the empire start criticizing the Abbasid leadership for kind of leading the people astray. For trying to get people to focus on, starting your own business and making a lot of money and getting your kids into university and like this kind of worldly wealth and power. Does that make sense? Which is not what Muhammad talked about. So a lot of these religious leaders start saying that the government is leading us into corruption. And if we're not doing what God wants us to in our life, what happens after we die? What's God going to think of us?
We go to hell.
Yeah. Thumbs down, negative afterlife for eternity. So a lot of religious leaders get very worried about that. And they directly blame the government for kind of leading the people down this kind of heretical path. And the religious leaders say, look, the focus of your life should not be going to work in your family business and working there 10 or 12 hours a day and making a lot of money and buying a big house and having all these luxuries. You should be rejecting all that and focusing on a daily basis on your relationship with God. And so they often, there's a lot of different religious movements within Islam at this time, kind of splinter groups that start talking about how you should accomplish this. And they often talk about just like a lot of religious leaders today, don't focus on making money and buying a big house and a nice car and all that stuff. Give up all your wealth and just live a simple, kind of very pious lifestyle. Does that make sense? Avoid all that corruption because they say it taints your soul, basically. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so the most famous group that gets going becomes known as the Sufi movement. And, they go out in public and they kind of grow they start off as a small movement, but it becomes a very kind of, they get a lot of converts to it, basically. So they start growing quite a lot, and they start popping up in all the different cities. They focus on a direct relationship with God. They want people to pray a lot, be in mosques a lot, and also pray on their own time in their own homes, to the point where almost kind of like a Buddhism, you come to like this giant enlightenment where you're so close to God that you kind of transcend the boundary between the human world and God's creation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Not really physically, but mentally and spiritually. You get closer to God, and they call this like an ecstasy, a moment of supreme realization. And they say that one of the key steps in doing that is to get rid of all your wealth and just generally avoid that kind of path in life. And they advertise themselves. When you become one of the people in this movement, they don't just want to grow their own movement, they want to convince the whole rest of society to give up their wealth and worldly ambitions and go back to the more simpler kind of pious Muslim lifestyle of Muhammad. So they're trying to convince the rest of society, join our idea. Give up your worldly pursuits.
People actually do it?
Yeah, quite a lot of them actually do it. And one way of advertising this idea is to get people to dress in the same kind of clothing. So when they walk down the street, you can recognize who they are, right? So they start wearing similar clothing, and they wear woolen clothing. And the Arabic word for that is suf. That's why it becomes known as the Sufi movement. They wear wool for a very specific reason. Have any ever worn a woolen coat or jacket or anything like that?
Mm.
What does that feel like?
Not nice.
Why not?
It can be coarse, it can be sort of rough. It's not comfortable. It can be hot.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Yeah. It's
heavy fabric, and it can be kind of abrasive on your skin, so it's not real comfortable stuff to wear. And they're wearing this in a part of the world where it can get to be 130 degrees outside. So it'd be like, walk outside here in, say, like in the desert in Fontana, which used to be a desert, a suburb built on top of a desert. Walk outside when it's 105 degrees outside with like long heavy pants and a jacket. And go for a walk for a few miles. That's what they're doing. And they're wearing that clothing to specifically tell society, we have transcended that human boundary, and we have such a deep relationship with God that like we can put up with that physical discomfort. Does that make sense? So it's seen as like
They don't care what people say, pretty much.
well, not just not caring what people say, but it's like a self-sacrifice. my physical pain doesn't matter anymore because I'm a member of this movement and it gives me so much perfection and joy that the physical torment, I just don't feel it. Does that make sense? So it's like almost like an out-of-body experience. Or that's how they advertise it. And they walk around in society like this, and it's easy to pick them out because everyone else is wearing cotton clothing. Because cotton, breathes well and it helps cool you off, or as well as it can. Does that make sense? So they become famous, and just like religious movements today, some people declare them to be kind of nutty, right? No? A lot of people don't want to do that to themselves, and so they say, well, there's no way I'm going to join that movement because that just looks horrible. But that's their kind of overall argument. That's where the label, the name comes from. So they're overall trying to convince others to join them, right? You have a choice to make. You can pursue corruption and tainting your soul, and you might take the risk of like eternal damnation, or you can join with my side. But it's your choice. Is that clear? There are other groups who aren't really in it for choice. These become known generally as the fundamentalists. They don't really like that people have a choice. The fundamentalists aren't willing to just take their argument to the people and say, well, why don't you just choose whichever path you want? The fundamentalists are much more in it for the destruction of corrupting influences. So they will attack wealthy families with big houses, and they'll kill them. As a message to the rest of the people, don't pursue that. That's not what God wants you to do. Of course, they justify this by saying God wants us to go out and kill the rich and powerful as a lesson to everybody else. But they will also go out and attack the university professors, people who are studying all these sciences and all these philosophies. A lot of the teachers don't really like that stuff. And a lot of the intellectuals in the universities, they start studying the fundamentalist perspective and start writing books about why it is mostly just based in violence and is what we call anti-intellectual. Does that make sense? You ever heard of that before? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's they get in arguments with the fundamentalists to try to logically prove or logically argue how the fundamentalist position is wrong. And what do the fundamentalists think of that? Yeah. What do fundamentalists think of it today? Are they in it for real logical arguments and any kind of data-based evidence or anything like that? No, they're in it. They think their belief is perfect, and anyone who disagrees with them is evil. And so they'll kill those people.
Why didn't the government interfere?
Well, they do every once in a while, but just like fundamentalists today, these are secret conspiracies, right? So yeah, the government will go out, they'll find the Unabomber, or they'll try to, or at least they'll say they're trying to. But if he's good at it, he can get away with it for a while. And I think the Unabomber is a good analogy to this, because if you know his history at all, he was bombing technological innovators because he thought that mass communication and the internet was a real danger to humanity, and he wanted to stop it. And they caught him, mid-90s or so, I think. Yeah, 96 or something. I can't remember exactly. He's still around. He's in jail still.
The Unicorn?
Oh, yeah. He's life in prison.
Oh, he's dead.
Is he?
He was executed in Texas.
No. Unabomber, yeah. He wasn't executed. He got a life sentence in prison. So, must be a very depressing place for him if he's heard of text messaging, because that wasn't even out when he went to jail. So, the ultimate torture would be for him to just sit in front of the computer for a little while. Here's what the internet has become in the last 20 years. But that might just piss him off even more so. But very kind of similar type of perspective. And some of these groups get so far into their own ideology that they don't even listen to logical arguments or intellectual arguments anymore. It's like anyone who attacks them logically is just like an enemy. and they look to take them out, sometimes violently.
Oh, you're right. I was thinking of Ted Bundy.
Yeah, he's dead. It's beyond this. But one of the major problems with some fundamentalist movements start revolutions that take over governments. So there are some fundamentalist-led types of government leaders out there. And eventually this will happen to, not this empire, but eventually the Ottoman Empire. There's a major problem when you get kind of fundamentalist leaders in office. They become so conservative, they don't want to change anything. They just think society has to be perfected or go back to the past to make it better. That they often shut down the innovative systems. They limit what universities can do, what they can study. Does that make sense? And that often starts a kind of intellectual or even technological stagnation for their whole society. And that eventually helps destroy the Ottoman state, skipping ahead many centuries. When you go into the year 1500, the Ottoman state is the most technologically advanced military in the world, and they're conquering places. They're on the march. A few hundred years later, when conservatives took over, they stopped all the technological change. So by the early 1900s, they're still fighting with the 1600 style army. And they get beaten in a big war, and their empire is destroyed. So that's the downside of long-term hardcore conservatism. It gets rid of all the experimentation and innovation and whatnot. And that can really cause kind of social and government, and even military stagnation that becomes very dangerous. And over the last few decades, even when you get conservative politicians in the United States that have gotten into high office and been running the government, they still invest pretty heavily in military technology because they learned that lesson. So even religiously based leaders, they still want to spend a huge amount of money on the U.S. military figuring out how to build more technologically advanced weapon systems. Does that make sense? So sometimes they learn a lesson, but other governments haven't, and they've sometimes paid the price for it. So the big difference, though, between the Sufi and the fundamentalist is that the Sufi will allow you to make your own decision. They just want to convince you to join them. The fundamentalists don't want to debate. They want to destroy the corrupting influences, or what they see as the corrupting influences. Does that make sense? And they're usually, movements become completely based in violence, or overwhelmingly based in violence. I don't want to say completely. There's a possibility out there. All right. So the Abbasids, they go into power around the year 750. They're pretty successful for about their first 50 or 60 years. They start running into big problems in the early 800s for several different reasons. Number one, in 809, the emperor, the caliph, died. And he had an official heir to the throne, but that guy's brother wanted to be the next king, and they develop factions. They both build up armies, and they go after each other in a big civil war. And that war lasts for, I think, about 4 years. So the military, the imperial army, is divided between who you're going to support, one side or the other. So it becomes tough for the soldiers to sit this out. And even the bureaucrats, the accountants and the tax collectors and the bridge builders, and they also have to choose sides in this. So even though one side won the Civil War within just 4 years, it splits the bureaucracy into two factions, two kind of new political parties. And over the next 2 or 3 decades, the party in power does everything it can to stay in power, to raise money for itself, to make sure that the opponents could never come back. Does that make sense? So they take bribes. They create new offices just to sell them to the highest bidder. Does that make sense? Just to keep themselves in power, to raise enough money to keep themselves in power. So that corrupts the entire bureaucracy. You start getting people in office who don't really know what they're doing, It's just that their family had a bunch of money to get them into the government. Does that make sense? And you never really want that in government, because once you get a government that's, it's like termites in a house. They'll eat away and eat away and eat away at it until the whole thing collapses. Unless you do something about it. And eventually that party came to distrust the military so much that they built a professional army of Mamluks, which is basically slaves, to be basically the police force in Baghdad itself. So they build up an ethnic army of outsiders from Baghdad, people not from Baghdad, and bring them in as basically the shock troops to make sure there's no riots in the capital city, and also possibly to oppress the other party. Does that make sense? So even the people in Baghdad itself, they start to see this as a foreign army that the government's bringing in to oppress the people. And a lot of people start thinking that the government's not on their side, the government is sold out, and they're only in it for their own power. And then you throw in all these different religious groups that are saying the whole system is corrupted in the first place. And in the early 800s, the government's having problems. And it's a lot like you see with U.S. politics today. You have two parties, and they both seem much more interested in getting to power or staying in power than they care about actually running the place well. Does it make sense? And if you do that for too long, and the roads aren't any good anymore, and the water supply is poisoned, and the bridges are falling apart, people live with that for a few decades and they get pissed off. So, going ahead a few decades into the late 800s, the government seems systematically corrupted to the point where the Egyptians almost always seem to be like the first people to rise up. The Egyptians don't want to be a part of the system anymore. They start a revolution and they win. So Egypt declares independence and goes off and creates its own country again. They break away from the empire. And that seems to be, again, the danger of a good example for all these other groups that now feel oppressed under the Abbasid. They all start rising up. The Abbasid armies, they can win every once in a while, but it's not till the early 900s where this is where the Iberians break away and they create their own kingdom, the Moorish kingdom. They call them, or textbooks will call them the Muslim Moors, but it's still a Islamic-based government, but it's an independent government from the empire. Does that make sense? And then just piece by piece, other groups start rising up to the point by 935, all areas outside of Baghdad have declared independence. The whole thing is just broken apart. And then there's a revolution in Baghdad itself in 945, 10 years later, and that harms the government so much, which is basically just a city government now, that an outside group actually invades and conquers Baghdad. The Abbasid kind of family rulers are kept on the throne, but they're told what to do by someone else. They're puppets. Does that make sense? So the Abbasid Empire in the late 800s, early 900s is like taking a big piece of glass and just dropping it on the ground. It just shatters. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different little kingdoms that all pop up as local leaders and populations try to take over their territory. Does that make sense? Okay, so the whole thing collapses. The Abbasid state is virtually gone by about 935. Outside of Baghdad, just doesn't exist. But these areas remain mostly Muslim populations. So just because the Abbasid imperial government just kind of collapses and disappears, those populations largely stay Muslim. They're just going with allegiance to local kings. So historians have analyzed, well, how did Islam survive this kind of government catastrophe? And usually the the examples that they bring up are that most of these people are reading the Quran, that's their holy book, so that kind of unifies their populations. And they still do the Hajj, which is the once in a lifetime, at least, pilgrimage to Mecca, where the Kaaba is. So that still permeates these territories. So Islam, as a religion, survives the collapse of this one government. Does that make sense? So it's like when the American Revolution hit, and suddenly they're not British anymore. They're all these 13 different little American governments. Doesn't mean Christianity went away. Does that make sense? They still have their religious ideas. They just live under a different government now, and they largely still live in the same territorial, geographic place. It's just called something else. And let's see. You have hundreds of different Muslim kings all over the whole region, and a lot of those kings, especially in the eastern areas, continue their invasions trying to conquer India. And that will go on for hundreds of years. It's not under one giant imperial army anymore. It's a lot of kind of smaller kings joining their little militias together to launch these invasions. And the battle lines go back and forth. They will conquer a place in northern India and control it for a while, and then there's a Indian revolution to get rid of the foreigners. And it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for hundreds of years. But just like the other places that Muslim leaders have conquered, they convert a lot of people in northern India to Islam. A lot of people join willingly. Some people join to get lower tax rates or something like that. This is an economic motivation. So a lot of people growing up and living in India convert to Islam and then get their families to convert. So there's kind of a split in the population. Islam is much more successful in the far northern Indian civilization, and much of the rest of India remains Hindu. But this creates a lot of social conflicts. I mean, families are torn apart, neighborhoods are torn apart according to religion, and they start arguing with each other. And eventually it becomes a pretty hateful argument, an insulting argument between Muslims and Hindus in northern India. So, and it tends to break down according to a couple major differences. Number one, Muslims are monotheists. They believe in this one creator God. And Hindus are polytheists. They believe in hundreds and hundreds of different gods that do all kinds of different jobs, if you remember that. Yeah. So the Muslims look at Hinduism, that polytheism, and they think this is heretical. It's insulting to the one creator God. And Hindus look at Islam, this monotheism, as just ridiculous, just very strange. And they're still arguing with each other about that today. And there's even violence associated with that complaint and those insults. Another one revolves around the caste system, which has been in place in northern India for a long time by this point. When Muslim populations enter and they start getting converts in northern India, they define the caste system as really pretty evil. Because the caste system divides society into these kind of social classes, basically, right? High class, middle class, low class. We've talked about that before. And Muslims believe all people are totally equal with each other. All people are completely even under God. God is the only difference.
Everybody's a sinner.
Yeah, everybody's the same. And they should all be paying attention to what God wants them to do. So Muslims tend to think that the caste system is like a source of evil. It divides society into a wealthy elite class and then a poor oppressed class. And Muslim theology is basically get rid of all that and treat everyone as equal. The Hindus look at the caste system as often assigned by all their hundreds of gods and the creative forces of the universe. So they look to keep it around. They think it's sanctioned by the gods.
You're predestined.
Yes. You know, and so Hindus, even to this day, often fight to keep the caste system in place. And usually, especially the people in the highest level, because they're protecting their power. So the caste system is still around in India, and it's still controversial today. But today, northern India, from the ancient world on the ancient map, northern India today has broken off and is a different country, a Muslim majority population. Does anyone know what that country is?
Bangladesh? Or
Pakistan. Bangladesh was originally part of Pakistan,
Yeah.
and eventually declared revolution in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they broke away.
So they speak Arab in Pakistan right now, right? Or is it both?
They speak Urdu.
Yeah, they
They
speak.
Urdu, yeah.
Yeah,
And some
it's their own
Farsi.
dialect, and that was the big controversy between Pakistan and Bangladesh. They tried to force what is now Bangladesh to accept the Pakistani dialect, basically, and the Bangladeshi people didn't want to put up with it, so they broke away. And it was a bloody revolution. It was a horrible revolution, or violent revolution. But yeah, not all places that are Muslim majority populations speak Arabic. Iran is Muslim majority and speaks Farsi, if I remember right.
Yeah.
Majority of them do, yeah. And each country that does speak Arabic has a totally different dialect.
Yep. So it's not just
Yeah.
one language, and I don't want to get into the details of that. That's a long conversation. But that violence continues today, and that's why India and Pakistan are. I mean, they're armed to the teeth against each other, and they each define the other as like a national enemy and supporting terrorism. There's terrorist attacks in both countries, and they blame each other for it. So, and there's right now, over the past couple months, there's a movement in Kashmir, which is really kind of between them, an area between the two, to try to align the majority of the people in Kashmir are Muslim, and they want to kind of join Pakistan, but India controls a bunch of the place, and there's a potential for a revolution, a civil war. And there's protests out there right now every day, and it's killed something like 800 people in the past couple months. Just people protesting in the streets and getting into conflicts with the local police, and they're killing each other in the streets. And now both countries have nuclear weapons, and some international analysts predict that the next big war, if it uses nuclear weapons, will probably be between those two countries. And if they go to war, it'd be absolutely horrible. Even if they don't fight with nuclear weapons, because India has the second biggest population in the world. They have 1 billion people they can send out to fight. Pakistan is something like the 7th biggest population in the world, so they have something like 200 million or some people. That war could kill 100 million people. Even without nuclear weapons, it could be absolutely unbelievably horrible. The big losers, though, for this part of the world, this conflict, which is up here on the kind of northwestern part of this map, are really the Buddhists, because they're nonviolent. They're not willing to fight it out. And this seems to be the point where what Buddhists are left in northern India leave, because this is a violence-ridden place. And they go a little bit further east into Tibet, and that's where and a lot of them also travel further into China and even Japan, and down into Southeast Asia. But those are the areas that become the home of Buddhism, worldwide Buddhism, for years and years and years, for centuries. And in the 1950s, China invaded Tibet and conquered it and made it part of China. So a lot of Buddhist leaders had to leave Tibet just to survive. So one of the main sources of Buddhism today is Southeast Asia. But it's a massive migration just to flee a war zone in northern India between Muslim invasions and Indian revolutions. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's, this is where Southeast Asia is, way down here. And Southeast Asia, the very corner. So you can see this is a large movement of people, and this is where Pakistan is today, to the northwest of India. So you can see that country is built in the places where the Muslims converted the most people, which is closest to where the Muslim Empire was. Does that make sense? Yeah, a lot of country borders today, and countries are built out of these geographic relationships. Okay. Skipping a few hundred years ahead. So the Abbasids go into their collapse phase in the early 900s, and then you get this fragmentation, like dropping a pane of glass on the ground. It just splits into hundreds and hundreds of different pieces. And there's all these different little kingdoms all over the place. And the next empire will not rise until the late 1200s. And this becomes known over time as the Ottoman Empire. They actually start off in the very northwestern corner of Anatolia, what is today Turkey, this kind of orangish area on this map. And it starts off under one kind of founding king called Osman I. And he's a very smart, strategic type of king, and he starts conquering his neighboring kingdoms and building his empire. So at first it's called the Osmanli Empire, named after him. But the word kind of, again, evolves over hundreds of years and becomes the Ottoman label. So it starts under him and goes into the 1300s and even beyond his lifetime. And it's not very big at first, but it has big ambitions, and that is to get Constantinople. The Osmanli Empire, again, is right next door to Constantinople, right in that area. And future Ottoman kings will figure out that the trick to conquering Constantinople is to conquer the land around it on the other side, to the west, on this kind of pinkish area on this map. Controlled access to the rivers and the kind of waterways, so you can limit the amount of boats that get into Constantinople, and you can really starve this population into surrender. And that's what the Ottomans will start doing. They'll not just conquer those areas in pink around the city, but they'll make also deals with people that Constantinople has repressed, has controlled for hundreds of years, and they're all up to fight the Byzantine government because they hate them. Does that make sense? So they want to take them out. So they start making political deals with those populations to the west of the city. And you can see the territorial growth. As you get into the 1300s, you get this kind of tan area in Anatolia, but also on the other side. And they're trying to control the waterways to eventually take the city. Then in the mid-1400s, a king comes to the Ottoman throne named Mehmet II, and he makes it his life's ambition to conquer the city. And he starts building up a giant army and a navy, and takes several years, but they're going to launch the attack. So that's what he is famous for, is really going all out to conquer Constantinople. Does that make sense? So even by this point, they already have it surrounded. And this is a closer map of the city. So you can see it's on this peninsula. Here, this big peninsula kind of sticking out eastward into the ocean. It's surrounded on three sides by water. So, and there's a ton of cliffs all around, basically. So it's really tough to land a boat right on that shoreline and attack the city. So it's virtually impossible. So that was a defensive plan for the city. The Byzantine leaders in the city planned on that. Then they built this giant series of walls to the west to guard against a land invasion. And those walls were seen as basically impenetrable. So the Ottomans have to figure out how are they going to do this. And the Ottomans figured that the best chance they could get was to take put their troops on boats and sail them around and try to land in kind of one of these areas along the northern shore where there's not cliffs that are as bad, and unload your troops, get behind the walls, and then attack the city from there. Does that make sense? And the Byzantines figured out that that was going on, so they laid basically spike strips across the water from one side to the other, so that if you're going through with your boat full of soldiers, you'll hit the spike strip, and just like cars that hit that on the freeway, yeah, you get a hole ripped in your boat and then it sinks. Does that make sense?
Smart.
Yep. But the Ottomans are smarter. The Ottoman eventual battle plan is to sail their troops on these giant boats. They actually cut one of the spike strips before so they can get through, but they can't cut this other one. It's called the Golden Horn or something, where it says boom. See that one up there? So instead of trying to just run it over, because that's a suicide mission, they go up to the shoreline up where it says 22 April. They land their boat there. They get their soldiers out of the boat. And they take the boat up out of the water, drag it across where this blue line is with the arrow, drag it over the land, put it back in the water on the other side, and then sail across and unload. And the Byzantines never planned on that one. So that was pretty shocking. And they don't just do it with one boat, they do it virtually their whole army. So they get behind the walls, and they conquer the city, because there's no more defenses. So I think it's in, 1453, with that battle plan, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. And the survivors say that the Ottomans went through and just massacred every Byzantine person, basically, but that historians question that account. The Ottomans conquered the city, and since it was so difficult to attack in the first place, the Ottomans put their capital city there. Because the place is a fortress.
What did they want to conquer it again? Just because it was leftover of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, it's a leftover part of the Roman Empire, and they also feel that once you conquered Constantinople, that leaves the rest of Europe open to invasion. Like Constantinople was the Europeans' last stand. And the Europeans felt that way too, so there's like panic all over Europe once the city falls. It's like, oh crap, man, it's all over. They're going to roll through all of Europe and wipe out Christianity. But the Ottomans moved their capital city there. They renamed the city Istanbul. That's spelled Istanbul, I think. Something like that. That's correct. And they will start attacking kind of into Europe, but their immediate concern is to actually attack southward, conquer down into Syria and Damascus, get the Eastern Mediterranean, then they attack Egypt and conquer Egypt, and then they attack down into the kind of old Muslim homelands, Mecca and Medina. They conquer, eventually they'll get to even old Persia, Mesopotamia, and then they'll launch their armies westward across the African coast. Their great ambition at that point seems to be to control the whole Mediterranean Sea, just like the Romans had, and just like the Umayyad wanted to. And it's not until they get all the way across, basically the coast of North Africa, that they're going to send their big armies to attack from Constantinople northwest up into Europe to try to conquer Europe. And really the furthest they ever get, you can see on that map, is Vienna, which is one of the big European cities at that time. So the Ottomans attack the Balkans, and that's like a geographical name for southeastern Europe, basically. And they conquer it. And they'll hold it for quite a while. Century or so, century and a half. And this is where you get the story of the gigantic, newly constituted Muslim imperial army coming to Europe to destroy all Christianity. And so a lot of these European kings get together again and they start sending armies east to try to figure out how to stop that, to save the religion, to save Christianity from genocide. But whether or not the Ottomans would have done that, who knows? Because they're very tolerant of Christians and Jews, and just like the other empires were. So that's really where it is by about the year 1500 when History 1 ends and you start History 2. So when you walk into that course, the Ottoman state is probably the most powerful in the world at that point, right at the year 1500, and all the Europeans are scared of it. They have the biggest armies and the most technologically advanced armies, and they still have all the scientific stuff that they have been studying. They're a rebuilt empire, and they're probably the most powerful in the world. So the Europeans are just trying to survive this for a few centuries. So about the 1700s is when the Europeans start to gain the upper hand, start to push the Ottoman armies back out of Europe and back toward Istanbul.